Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the sixth now of our Town Hall series. We appreciate the hundreds of you who join us each time for these series, and again, thank you for everything you've been doing to help us in the community. We're in a better place today than we were last time, and last time we were in a better place than the time before, so it's nice to talk to y'all today, and I'll be updating you later today in terms of those data in the community, etc. But first, we're going to really have some very exciting presentations today, and I want to thank the Society for Leading Medicine, and I want to thank our chairs, Dan and Huntley Kubitza, for helping kind of shepherd these going forward, and they will host each of these sessions going forward. If you would like information on the Society for Leading Medicine, we'll have an email at the end for you in terms of that email that you can find out more. I'd also like to thank the members of the Advancing Nursing Excellence Council, which is led by Emily Crosswell, as well as the Behavioral Health Task Force, which is led by David Lumpkins. They are serving as our hosts for this specific session. You'll see for obviously very good reason with the topic that we're having. And in the material that was emailed to you, you can see the names of those leaders that are part of those councils, and we thank all of them for hosting today. Now, we're going to see a little bit later from Dr. Dirk Sostman, who's our Chief Academic Officer, who's going to once again update us on the current status of treatments and vaccines. We're also joined by Dr. Ben Weinstein, who is the Chair of our Department of Behavioral Health. He'll speak to us really about the myriad impacts of COVID on our psychiatric health, both directly and obviously indirectly through all of the challenge that we've faced through COVID. But first, we're going to hear from Dr. Liisa Ortegon, who's our Chief Nursing Executive. She holds the Crowning Achievement Centennial Chair in Nursing Excellence, and she's going to speak to us about maintaining and enhancing nursing excellence throughout a pandemic, and really her role and the role of the countless nurses across our system who truly have been heroic through all of this. So with that, Liisa, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Well, today I'm going to focus on how we continue to provide unparalleled nursing care here at Houston Methodist Hospital and within our system throughout the pandemic and afterwards. To start out with, I'm going to focus on nursing knowledge, how we assess patients and continue to assess patients, continue to have an individualized plan of care, and how we're improving more employee morale to better patient outcomes. To start out with, always at nursing here at Houston Methodist Hospital, we are here to recruit the best and the brightest. And by saying that, all of our nurses are Bachelors of Science in Nursing prepared, which means they have the minimum requirements of chemistry, physics, biology, all the pre-med courses that physicians take, in addition to a curriculum of nursing courses. And then they also have to pass a high-level interview of critical thinking and judgment. And having the best and brightest right from coming in the door is the basis of our nursing team here at Houston Methodist being one of the world-class teams in nursing. One of the things that we look at is the age of our RNs, and I presented this to the Advancing Nursing Excellence Committee. And the reason we do look at this is because we want to make sure that we are pretty flat across the board, because that demonstrates that we have novice nurses coming in and seasoned nurses able to train those novice nurses and intermediate nurses in between, so that we always have a growing pipeline. It is also very important to us in the Houston Methodist system to look at the ethnicity of our RNs, because we are taking care of a very diverse population in our community and rely on these different cultures and different learnings to be able to take care of our patients in the way that they choose to. I would like to point out at Houston Methodist Hospital campus, we do have a 92% rate of bachelor's prepared nurses. This is a four-year degree in university. The national average is 71%. And beyond that, 7% of our nurses hold a master's or doctoral degree. National average is 5%. So we have an extremely strong foundation of knowledge of these nurses coming in. We begin patient assessment, and many of our nurses come in a little overwhelmed because our standards are very, very high. So we have developed a Methodist Physical Assessment certification through the Center of Nursing Research, Education, and Practice, and that ensures that every nurse that enters our Methodist system is able to practice nursing at the Methodist standards, which is much more superior compared to the state or the certification levels. And what we've always have to take into consideration too is our patients are very individualized, and they are also overwhelmed, especially during this COVID pandemic. Social media has not been our friend. COVID is a disease that has been changing daily with information, and our patients are extremely overwhelmed. And I look back on a statement that Dr. Boom made early on in the COVID pandemic. He said, trust your training. That message has been resonated into the nursing staff so that they are not overwhelmed, and they're helping minimize the anxiety, social isolation, and loneliness of our patients. This graph has been shown before in one of the presentations here, but one of the key components I want to talk about is the disillusionment phase. That is where the majority of the population is in Houston right now. And that is because the COVID pandemic continues, it's cyclical, we can't control the future. And so at this point, we have to make sure that our nurses are relying on their training in order to be able to assess patients and assess each other for risk factors, such as suicidal ideations, substance abuse, fear, loneliness, and social isolation. All of those variables, Dr. Weinstein, I'm sure, will discuss, in fact, impact patient mortality. So if our staff are feeling it, they will be not focused on our patients. And if our patients are feeling it, it will impact their mortality. So this is critical that our nurses remain focused. I'm not sure if you're aware, I love this slide because when a nurse walks in a room, they're not simply talking to a patient. They're taking all of their training and knowledge, their clinical expertise, the science that they have learned, and compressing multiple variables to determine what the patient needs in their therapy and in their plan of care. Physicians do the same. And so as you can see, when we talk to patients and talk with the families, we are condensing a bunch of variables to determine what is the best treatment plan for them to move forward and have improved outcomes. Here are some of those variables that we look at when it comes to suicidal ideation and loneliness. Are they apathetic? What are their facial expressions like? Their personal hygiene, are they willing to get up in a chair and move around? Basically, how they're behaving, are they age appropriate, and what does their self-esteem look like? Anxiety, family responsibilities, financial responsibilities, homeschooling of children are additional stressors that our staff and patients are going through. And as you can see in these photos, there are clinicians at the bedside in full PPE, personal protective equipment, still doing what nurses should do, really assessing their patients close and up front to make sure that we can help the family as a whole, which then also minimizes the worries of the patient. From all of this information, and this is only a small piece, Dr. Weinstein and I were talking earlier that what we're presenting today is only one small element of what the clinicians look at when they're devising a plan of care for a patient. But we want to make sure the patient understands the plan of care. We want to make sure, especially during the COVID crisis, because we have limited visitors and patients are in isolation, they don't see the staff's normal smiling faces, not able to see their expressions. We want to give them opportunity to connect with their family or significant others. And again, doing all of that increases their chance of survival. And we also make sure we have calming techniques available to them. Music therapy, we've deployed echo dots and various other technology in the room. And one of the key stories that I wanted to tell you today was how we work as an interdisciplinary team. It's not just nursing, it's the entire organization. It takes a village to make things happen around here and to be world class. There was a patient that was admitted on one of our intermediate floors, very, very, very sick, and was a step away from going to the ICU. I found out 2 days later after visiting her, her daughter was on the medical floor, very, very sick and a step away from going to the intermediate floor. Within 48 hours, because the nurses were persistent with these patients in doing their breathing treatments along with respiratory therapy, getting patients up in the chair, motivating them, and making sure that we're giving them the tools that they can calm their anxiety, the mother looked phenomenal. And 48 hours later was able to transfer to the floor. But prior to that, I went to visit the daughter, and the daughter did not improve at all. And I asked the staff why. They said she really is depressed. She's not willing to do the treatments. And if she continues down this trail, she is going to decline. Put on my garb, went in the room and talked with the daughter. And next thing you know, we had 2 iPads, and the mother and daughter are having a competition on their incentive spirometers, who can get the ping pong ball higher. And it's basically a device to expand their lungs and make sure that we're not developing pneumonia and other complications. Both of those patients are now at home and doing very, very well, and are grateful to the entire team for helping them get out of the hospital and do very well. At times, though, patients aren't going to do well, and that's a very small population. We do have patients that have high comorbidities, and especially with COVID, it has been a very big challenge. But nurses have been front and center at the bedside with those patients, ensuring they are dying with dignity, and that the families, although visitation has been extremely limited, we have allowed some visitors come in to have their last moments with their loved one. But in general, we have been the ones holding the iPads so that families could say their last goodbye while the nurse is holding their hand. We have received a multitude of letters from families of those patients stating how grateful they were that their loved one was not there alone and that they could be there with them. So we also make sure that we are there at the end of the life, ensuring the patient has spiritual support. Music therapy, we had a patient that loved jazz music, and we made sure it was playing in his last moments of life. The last thing I wanted to talk about was employee morale here at Houston Methodist. I think our culture, first of all here, I care, and with that is teaching everybody that comes to work, you are valued, you are doing meaningful work, and you are making a difference in those you touch, is so important. And that foundation has allowed us through crisis to be able to deal with the most difficult fears and emotions that we've seen in society to date. Leadership visibility has been above and beyond during this crisis because we are assessing our employees, making sure that they're not in that disillusionment phase and suffering from any of the signs and symptoms. But we've also had donors in the community that have helped us out, and I want to thank you all very much, especially the Advancing Nursing Excellence Committee. You have gone above and beyond, and I don't think you know how much your meals, your cards, all of those efforts have meant to the staff. And one of the things that we did deploy with the donor funds was every nurse, therapist, unit secretary, and patient care assistant that was in a COVID unit received an annual SHIP membership. Just the fact that they can order their groceries online at no extra charge, have them shipped to their home, protects the public that A, we do not have a potentially infectious employee or visitor in a grocery store, but also minimizes their stress load. They have enough stress at work that now they don't have to take an hour or 2 out of their day to go to the grocery store. And they have been elated with that gift, and it is an annual membership, and I wanted to say thank you. Employee morale does directly impact patient mortality. If our employees are not at a high level of engagement, they will miss signs and symptoms of patients, and they will then in turn impact patient mortality. I also wanted to point out, I wanted to thank the physicians, the medical staff of Houston Methodist Hospital. Unbeknownst to me, they sent a letter for me to proof, and it was a letter to thank the nursing teams for being front and center throughout this pandemic. The nurses were always the one that was in the room, even when physicians were doing virtual rounds. And the reason they were was because physicians, they're at risk if they go into each and every patient's room that they are assigned to, where the nurses, we have 2 to 4 patients to care for. And they were in the rooms taking care of those patients, and the physicians wanted to thank them, thank their profession for everything they've done. So Dr. Boom, I wanted to take this moment again to thank you for saying, trust your training. It really resonated with the staff and calmed the fears, and it's because of that we've had the outcomes for our patients that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Liisa, and thank you for the amazing, amazing work that you yourself have done, the leadership you've provided, the visibility that you described. You know, I love that story about the competition on the ping pong balls. You know, that's a perfect example of how nurses, you know, with their compassion and just getting to know patients and their creativity and bringing innovation into the mix actually touch people's lives and make a difference. And I'm so proud of our medical staff also in everything they've done. I'm also proud of them for that acknowledgement of our nursing staff. I think all of us as physicians would readily acknowledge that nurses really are the center point and the soul of a hospital. I mean, they spend time throughout the day with our patients and care for our patients all day long, and the physicians come in and go and obviously care for large groups of people and are massively important as well, but that personal touch and that ongoing touch and getting to know people and their families, such a critical role. And so very proud of our nurses. And
thank you
so
much.
Liisa, really am. So now we're going to move and talk a little bit about how tough COVID has been. It's tough directly because it affects the neurological system, as we've talked about. It affects psychiatric health and some direct impact. It's also been really tough, obviously, for caregivers, as has been alluded to, for all of the general population because of how much our social construct really has changed for all of us. We're not built to be isolated human beings sitting at home. That's not who we are, and that's not how we're structured. So we're really privileged to have Ben Weinstein here, who, as I said, is our chair of behavioral health. He holds the C. James and Carole Walter Looke Presidential Distinguished Centennial Chair in Behavioral Health. That's a mouthful, but all of those modifiers say it's the big chair. And I want to thank Carole and Jim for their incredible generosity in so many ways, and this has been one of those very impactful areas where they have been so generous and made such an impact on us. I also want to welcome Jim's guests from the Petroleum Club, who are again joining us today as part of this. So now let me turn things over to Dr. Weinstein.
Thank you, Mark. I want to say thank you to you and to other leaders at Methodist like Dirk here, Roberta Schwartz, Rob Phillips, for the wonderful leadership and compassion you've shown to our employees and patients. You've been really, truly inspiring to all of us, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful. Here we go. I want to talk about briefly the scope of what many are calling the horrible year. For me, this year started in an auspicious way. On New Year's Eve, I lost a very good friend, a nurse, Philippa Ashford, who died by that stray bullet. And the year has been like that for many of us. We've lost 1 in 1,700 Americans. 1 out of 53 has been infected. 1 out of 13 people have lost their jobs. Substance abuse is on the rise. 1 in 3 Americans have depression and anxiety. 1 in 10 Americans have considered suicide during this pandemic. Calls to local hotlines are increased. The Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute is predicting that we'll lose up to 1,500 additional Texans to suicide and overdose. Use and requirements for antidepressants, anti-anxiety medicines, and unfortunately alcohol are up dramatically. The reason all of this has been so hard is that we have a perfect storm here for psychological distress. Isolation from friends, family, loved ones, coworkers is the enemy of health. We're now living in a virtual world. I work from home. Our schools are closed. We're told to avoid our friends and family and social gatherings, the things that are normally sustaining. And society is frayed. Our economy is unstable. Families are afraid of losing their loved ones. They're afraid of being homeless and even going hungry. Communities are divided, polarized. We've lost faith and trust. And a real enemy here to our health is too much information, bad information, and at times disinformation, because it erodes our ability to connect with our fellow man. And this is a chronic condition. No one knows when it will end. And so it can engender significant hopelessness. Healthcare workers have been greatly impacted. Even prior to COVID, many physicians had significant symptoms of burnout. We were losing a lot of physicians to choosing other jobs and early retirement. COVID has caused problems in that, for the first time, many of us around the nation have faced moral injury at work, where there have been limited resources and inability to do what's right, we have been spared that for the most part here in Houston because we've had really wonderful leaders who have been proactive and have made sure that our folks on the front line can do their jobs as safest as possible to themselves and to our patients. But people live with fear of infection, fear of transmitting infection to their loved one, and many of us know peers that have died. 50% of people who take care of COVID patients have significant signs of post-traumatic stress, depression, and there's been an anecdotal increase in suicide among nurses and physicians. COVID infection is particularly bad for your brain and for your mental health. We're seeing that your brain itself can become infected. The illness can starve you of oxygen. The systemic inflammatory effects of the illness does not spare your brain. People are having strokes, and the medical interventions required to save their lives have come at a cost as well. We're seeing in the short term people getting encephalopathic, delirious. Their higher order brain functioning will not work when they're acutely ill. In the intermediate term, we're seeing people with significant distress. People who have recovered are experiencing something that's being called COVID fog. They are tired, they are anxious, they have higher rates of depression, irritability, insomnia, and deficits in cognition. 15% have diagnosable mood disorders or anxiety disorders, and up to a third have PTSD. And the long-term effects, we don't know. Many people ask me, what can we do? And I think that the answers for healthcare workers, the answers for patients, and the answers for society really boil down to many of the same things. We are in this together. That we have more in common than we have uncommon. We need to connect with friends and loved ones, even if virtually. Is it the same as being able to reach out and shake someone's hand or give them a hug? It's not. Is it as good as that? No. Touch, human touch, actually has significant impact on our immune functioning and improves our health. Right now, that's not good for us. I want to tell you that I really have a problem with some of the phrasing that we use. Everyone tells us to socially distance. I don't agree with that. We need to physically distance. Socially, we need to reach out and connect with each other just like we always do. And actually, I've taken this opportunity. I've reconnected with friends and loved ones who I hadn't talked to in a long time. Friends from childhood, friends from college. I have Zoom calls with, every week, and I'm actually closer with them now than I was before. And even if we can't reach out and be with others, we need to reconnect with ourselves. Who are we? What do we believe in? What matters to us? We need to take this opportunity to recognize we can't do everything all at once. We can't operate in the world in the way we used to. And that's a loss. But we have to slow things down and focus on what matters. We need to be present here in the moment. Using mindfulness techniques, which actually has been championed by Dr. Phillips, helps us reconnect to the moment and be present. And that's what we need to do to be good physicians, good nurses, good fathers, good sons. We need to be open to experiences that are good and bad. We need to acknowledge when we are suffering and not deny it. Denying the suffering sends the message that those things that we've lost don't matter. And they do matter. Acknowledge that. Accept that there's things in the world that we can't control. And experience the good. When we shut down our experience of bad things, we also shut down our ability to experience what's good and valuable in this world. And that's where the true loss happens. Do what matters. Understand what's important to you. Show kindness and gratitude. Kindness is one of the few things we have in this world that we can give, and it enriches both us and the people we give it to. It is a limitless resource, and it is healing to all. And remember, we're not martyrs. We need to take care of ourselves. Get rest, eat well, exercise. Do the things that all of us know that we should do and maybe aren't always as good as doing as we should. What are we doing here at Methodist? At Methodist, we truly believe and live our values. Our emergency rooms are open for people in distress. Our inpatient psychiatry unit is open. People are there and ready to help. When others in the medical center have shut down their inpatient psychiatry units because they lose money, Methodist, for years and years, has kept it open for those in need. Our hospitalized patients have access to psychiatrists, and now people who will do individual therapy to help people who are in crisis. We have a wonderful music therapy department, probably the best in the country, and it's been headed by the Center for Performing Arts and Medicine, and we are so grateful. In psychiatry, we've adapted to this virtual world. It's actually been better than I thought it would be. I'll tell you that I've been a person that's held out. I've been very skeptical over the years of virtual care, and I've gotten used to it. And I appreciate that actually I can do my job still and not have to endanger my patients by potentially exposing them to try to help them. And I've actually found, and our patients have told us, that after a little bit of time getting used to it, it actually is pretty good. It works well, and you can still connect, even through a screen. We have recognized the tremendous impact in our community, and we're working hard to try to find ways to meet our patients where they are, to give them easy access to behavioral health services. And we are working to integrate our services into primary care. Most people, are used to going and seeing their primary care physician, getting their blood pressure checked, getting their, blood sugar evaluated, making sure they don't have diabetes. Our primary care people are also checking in with our patients about how they're doing. And Methodist is working to provide resources there with our primary care clinicians to help them provide better behavioral health care by having a psychiatrist in the background available to consult with them and help them with their patients, and providing therapists for our patients who are struggling. This is what we can do now to meet people where they are and meet the incredible demand in the community for care. We can do this in an efficient and caring way, and I'm proud that Methodist is leading in the nation in doing this initiative. We're working to improve access to care for our patients with partners in the community. We're working to take care of our doctors and our nurses and our staff members so that they're out there and ready to take care of our patients. And we can't forget science. At our heart, doctors are all scientists, and we think that although we want to work with compassion, we can't forget that part of our lives. And we are actively collecting data on the psychological impact following COVID hospitalization, both in Houston and even with international partners. And we're also we've had an interest in inflammatory disorders and the effect of inflammation on brain and mood, and we are working to enhance current studies and plan new ones. There are resources out there if you're struggling. Here are a few. There's national hotlines. There is a Texas mental health support line. Use these. They're out there and free. They'll help you. I've included at the bottom, and I hope we'll get the actual links to you. There's some free mindfulness training exercises at a nice website called Act Mindfully. I encourage you to download it and be open to trying it. It's actually evidence-based and helps reduce people's distress. And there's also a really nice pamphlet from the World Health Organization about how we can do what matters in times of stress. That's what helps us connect to life again. That's part of living life despite what's going on and not waiting for everything to go away. If we do that, we're just going to be holding our breath and missing out on everything now, and that would be a tremendous loss. I look forward to your questions. Thank you for joining us. And I'd like to take just a moment and thank the Looke family and the Lumpkins family, who have been tremendously supportive in our efforts, and we are truly grateful. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how to follow that. That's a wow. So inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Weinstein, for two very inspiring talks. Dirk, I think we have our work cut out for us after. I love your kindness is a limited resource. That is such great advice, especially in today's world with everything going on around us with the pandemic and with all the conversations and the strife in our country and everything else. I personally am going to go out and I'm going to try and limitlessly be kind today. Maybe all of us could do that. I think that'd be pretty amazing.
In reality, what brings a lot of us into medicine and nursing is that we find out that actually we get paid to do things that are good for ourselves. It's truly wonderful. It makes every day here at Methodist the best.
Amen. Big amen. I completely agree. So now we're going to move on. I know I learn a ton every time I hear Dirk speak, so I know all of us are, and has done such a great job bringing us all up to date on the new progress on treatments and vaccines. Dirk is, of course, our Chief Academic Officer. He holds the Ernest Cockrell Jr. Presidential Distinguished Chair. Again, huge thanks to the Cockrell family for their decades of support of Houston Methodist, and particularly with the Houston Methodist Academic Institute and Research Institute, and Dirk and others. So Dirk?
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ben and Liisa, for those wonderful presentations. It really reminds us how complicated, how far-reaching, how deeply this pandemic has affected us as individuals and members of society. And we are, in the research and academic realm, really honored to be trying to provide treatments and vaccines and databases that will help folks like you do your jobs. And just thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be back with you all, and thank you as always for your interest, your really incredibly intelligent questions, and your support. So with that, let us just remember that control of infectious diseases is a three-legged stool. It's not just testing, it's not just treatments, it's not just vaccines and other forms of immunization. It's all of those things working together in a coordinated fashion that really is required for controlling infections. So let me give you a couple of updates on things that we've touched on in previous sessions. First off, steroids. And I'm not going to ask you to focus on any of the details of these randomized controlled trials, but just remember that in the United Kingdom there was this trial called Recovery that showed that dexamethasone, a cheap, well-known steroid drug, was able to significantly reduce the death in the most severely ill patients with COVID-19. The update that I want to give you today is that several other trials have been done with dexamethasone and other related steroids, and the results are very, very consistent. This finding stands the test of time. It holds water. And really these should be the standard of care for the sickest patients. Remember now that if you have a mild form of COVID-19, you don't need steroids, they're not going to help you, and there's some suggestion they may even be harmful by suppressing the good inflammatory response that helps to clear the virus. So we talked, and obviously this has been in the news here in Houston a lot, the convalescent plasma treatment. This has been very controversial lately, and honestly, in my opinion, it's been a bit of a turf war between the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, and the White House. There have been a number of studies done with convalescent plasma. Very few of them are randomized controlled trials, which, as you know, is the gold standard for medical clinical evidence. And that fact has been interpreted in different ways by different groups. The FDA looked at the data, and as you can see, virtually all of these trials, and when you aggregate the data, the effect ratio is much less than 1, meaning that it saves lives. I personally believe this. There's a rational mechanism behind it. The consistency of the data is very impressive to me. But there is room for argument about this because only 2 of these are randomized controlled trials. Why is that? Well, partly it's just this rush to get treatments to patients who are sick and dying. Partly it's things like what we experienced here. We were planning to do a randomized controlled trial, but our ethics committee felt that in really sick patients, giving a placebo of unimmune plasma could volume overload the patients, make them sicker, and it really wasn't appropriate at that time. And I believe this is probably what's happened in other circumstances. So you may have read, government panel refuses to endorse plasma, and then you read in another newspaper article, FDA approves widespread use of plasma for treating COVID-19. And I don't blame you for feeling a little whipsawed by this. I think it's just a manifestation of what Mark Boom said in a previous town hall. Science is messy in real time. After all the histories are written and everything is glossed over, it seems like it's just this stepwise progression from one discovery to another. But in fact, it's more like 2 steps forward and 1 step back in many cases. We are moving forward with trials of monoclonal antibodies, which really are kind of the revved up, supercharged version of convalescent plasma, if you will. And these are randomized controlled trials, and we're hoping for very good outcomes and good results with these. These can not only be used for treating COVID-19, but also as a form of emergency vaccination in people who've been exposed. So really, really excited about these trials. What about antiviral drugs? Well, the Act 3 trial is a randomized controlled trial sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, remdesivir plus or minus beta interferon. It has not started recruiting yet, but we are a site. We are all signed up and ready to go as soon as they give as soon as they drop the checkered flag, so to speak. But there are a ton of opportunities for antiviral drugs. We are currently working with 2 and about to start a trial of a third, favipiravir, AT527, and MK4482, also known by a different identifier. Now, the interesting thing about this is that all of these drugs act on the enzyme that copies the virus's RNA. But there are many, many other steps in the virus's life cycle that can be potentially interfered with by drugs. So we think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for new treatments. Okay, what about immunity and vaccination? Well, I'm going to hit you with an equation, and this is not just me being mean. It's important to understand. And that's the whole issue of herd immunity. And there's actually a real simple equation that describes this. The percentage of the population that needs to be immune, either because they had the disease or because they got vaccinated, is equal to 1, that is 100%, minus 1 over the replication factor for the virus. And so, for example, in measles, which has a very high replication factor, I mean, basically, if you're in a room with somebody with measles for 10 minutes, you got measles unless you're immune. Almost 100% of the population has got to be immune to prevent epidemic spread of the measles virus. And this, parenthetically, is why immunizing children against measles is so, so important. Well, let's look at COVID-19. You've read probably that the R0 of COVID-19 is around 3, maybe 4, maybe 2.5. That means that about 2/3 of the population has got to be immune to prevent the spread in order to achieve herd immunity. You've probably also seen that in Houston, the RT, which is the actual in real life transmission factor, the R0 is kind of the worst case scenario where nobody's immune, nobody's had the disease before, and there's no way to control it. So that's kind of the worst case. But in Houston, we've been down in the 1.1 range, which means we're almost at the range where the virus can be quenched. And in that case, a very small number of people actually need to be immune to achieve the functional herd immunity. And this is why the masking, the hand washing, the physical distancing, I totally agree with you, Ben, it's not social distancing, it's physical distancing that we care about. That's why these things are so, so important, because we don't have 67% of the population immune. Hopefully we will when we have a vaccine, but the only way to do that now would be basically to just let it rip. And I think the people who are in essence recommending that are terribly, terribly ill-informed and potentially doing us great harm. So you don't have to remember the math here. You have to remember that until we have a vaccine, it's that behavioral immunity of masking, hand washing, and physical distancing that is going to keep you safe. So what about immunity? There's been a lot of stuff about, oh, the antibodies don't last, and you're just going to get reinfected, and vaccines are not going to work. And I really think this is very alarmist and really not borne out by the majority of the data. For example, there was a recent study published in the New England Journal of the entire population of Iceland, which is a very kind of closed society, and they know everything about everybody. They looked at how long antibodies persist, and it's at least for a few months. We also know that the immunity is probably a lot more complicated. First of all, the cellular immunity is super important, and we know that patients who've recovered from COVID-19, patients who've been immunized, have really robust cell-mediated immunity. And the immune cells really are the ones that patrol the body, recognize foreign invaders, and they are the ones that end up making the antibodies. So although lots of viral diseases, you'll have antibodies in your bloodstream for life, in a lot you won't. But they can be summoned back by these immune cells. We're also finding, and you may or may not know this, but there are 4 coronaviruses very closely related to SARS-CoV-2 that circulate in the population normally, and they cause about 20 or 25% of common cold symptoms. Well, it turns out that a lot of SARS-CoV-2 patients have T cells that are reactive to these, and a lot of people who have not been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 have T cells that react to SARS-CoV-2, probably because of cross-reaction from the seasonal coronaviruses. So we don't really understand all the ramifications of the things I've told you in the last few slides. Suffice it to say that the actual circulation of the virus in the population is probably a whole lot more complicated than just this very simplistic understanding of it. And it is probably one of the factors involved in the peaks and valleys that we see of the pandemic in different locations. I mean, you may have read in the newspaper that Europe, which really had this thing knocked, now is a hotspot again. Back in April, we were sitting in the catbird seat here in Houston watching the New York get devastated. Then in July, we got hit ourselves. Things are a lot better now, but we're not out of the woods. That doesn't prove a thing about what will or won't happen in November here in Houston. So it's really complicated, but some things like the behavioral immunity, wear a mask, wash your hands, physically distance, those things are things you can rely on. What about the vaccines? Well, the big news this week was that the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine trial got put on pause because one subject, who I believe the data is that it was in the group that actually got the vaccine, not the placebo, developed a very serious neurological condition called symptoms basically of transverse myelitis or spinal cord inflammation. This is something that has been seen very rarely with other vaccines, and so it's of great concern and potentially could derail this particular vaccine candidate. Now, paradoxically, I'm really encouraged by this development because it shows that people are taking this serious. The company and the health regulators have all done the right thing. They've paused the trial. There's a totally independent group of experts going to review this case. They're going to review the statistics. because obviously it could just be a bad coincidence. These transverse myelidities can occur for many, many reasons, and maybe it's just somebody who got unlucky. Does this mean that the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine and the J&J vaccine and the Novavax vaccine are all dangerous? No, it doesn't mean that at all. These vaccines have many components. Even if it were to turn out that the Oxford vaccine has this serious potential side effect, it does not necessarily mean that any of the others would do so. So the stretch goal for getting a vaccine approved would still be kind of the end of the year. There is a big FDA meeting on October 22nd. We'll see what happens there. Probably the only ones that could possibly get approved at that meeting would be the Pfizer vaccine, maybe the Moderna vaccine. I don't see it happening with the AstraZeneca vaccine now. I think the end of the year is still a realistic target, however. So what could it look like? We get a vaccine approved, what happens? Well, a couple of basic scenarios for how this could play out. Best case, the vaccine is a silver bullet. It's 90% effective, prevents infection, very few side effects other than sore arm and a little self-limited fever and fatigue. That really would be a silver bullet. That would be a game changer for society. And then the question would be, how fast can you get this out and get it administered? More likely is the kind of, influenza vaccine scenario, where it's effective. It cleared the bar that the FDA set for effectiveness in order to be approved. So 50 to 60% effective. Again, few side effects. Well, remember the three-legged stool. This vaccine is going to be really useful, but we're going to have to keep testing, and we're going to have to keep developing treatments. We're going to have to continue to exhibit those behavioral immunity precautions. What are some less happy outcomes? Well, one is that nobody develops a vaccine in this first round that actually is 50% effective. That means we got to wait for the next generation. As you know, there's about 150 vaccines under development. It is almost certain that one or more of them is going to work. But this could mean that this nasty situation we're in now could drag on for many more months. Or the kind of worst case scenario, there are bad side effects. Nobody wants to take this vaccine. Nobody's going to approve it. The paradigm I always bring up is, well, would you rather have a sore arm and fever and have to go to bed early with Tylenol one night, or would you rather take a risk of dying? That's pretty easy. Would you rather take a risk of developing transverse myelitis and being paralyzed for the rest of your life? Well, that's a harder calculus. Nobody's going to do that. That means, again, we're going to have to wait for the next generation of vaccines, and it's also going to mean that safety testing is going to take a lot longer. The bar for safety testing is going to be a lot higher, and we're going to be in this situation for a lot longer. I think we're probably going to be scenario 2. Stretch goal would be scenario 1. I don't think the doomsday scenarios are going to happen. So I remain optimistic. I remain a volunteer for vaccine trials, and I will get in line to be one of the first people to be vaccinated once there's one approved. And lastly, remember, winter is coming. You're going to be inside with a bunch of people. It's going to be dry air, it's going to be heated air, you're going to be all that stuff. The virus loves those conditions. So, get a humidifier, circulate some fresh air indoors, maybe wear a face mask. There's a question about saline rinses. Those are not a bad idea at all. Recent data shows that vitamin D supplements could be helpful. If your vitamin D levels are normal, you don't need vitamin D. It's a fat-soluble vitamin. It builds up in your body. It can be toxic. But if your levels are low, I would take it. Wash your hands, get a lot of sleep, get your flu shot. With that, thank you so much for your interest and your attention. Thank you, Mark.
Dirk. Well, thank you, Dirk. Very interesting as always, and still I think some good optimistic news for the future. Some caution, of course, with the vaccine trial, but I've said this a million times. The reason vaccines in the United States are so safe is because they go through a very rigorous scientific process, and these need to go through that same rigorous scientific process. So, like you, I see that as a good thing, that we are actually following that very much and very carefully. Obviously hoping that these all don't prove to cause problems and that we have to wait for a next generation. But like you, I remain very optimistic. All right, so I'm going to bring you up to date then on where things stand in Houston, and then I will talk about some of the questions that you've asked really around what's happening in Houston, schools, many of the usual topics that we can update today. So what you see here is the early warning signs dashboard we do at the Texas Medical Center. This is number of cases per week. We've come down based on these data over half across the greater Houston area. Now I'm going to put a huge caveat that I've put before, which is, we've more and more figured out that the state has some delays in its data, some batching in its data. What that actually looks like it means as you delve into it, we've not been able to get the data from them. We've actually, as the TMC as a whole, sent them a letter to the state urging them to at least release the data to us so we could parse it by date of test rather than date of reporting, which would help a great deal. We've not gotten that. There was a article recently in the paper where somebody leaked some information that does give us a little bit of insight in that. The bottom line, if anything right now, this is overstating this in the community, which isn't an entirely bad thing as we're trying to sort out and urge a little patience in opening up and make sure that we do things right. But it's a big problem if we think about identification of a next surge or where things might go. And so I'm working a great deal to do that. There's an answer here, which is getting the county and city and TMC data all synchronized. We're working on that. Not quite gotten there with the county and city yet. So I still look at the TMC data or our data as kind of the data that I can rely upon the most. We report this, but it is not our data. It's data that comes from the state. So this is Houston Methodist data. In the orange line, you see the percentage of positivity, but in the blue bars, you see the number of patients positive diagnosed each day. So if you go all the way back with me to that kind of dip plateau in the middle there, that was the end of April, most of May, where we were seeing, 15, 18 cases positive. Now we were testing less then, but we were seeing a pretty small number of patients. You can see with the peak, we got to where we were on average, on a weekly average, probably in the 400 range or so. Our peak day was over 550. And now if you go with me to the bottom right, you'll see that much lower. Still some days in the higher 70, 80 range. This last sort of 7-day rolling average is in the 45 range or so. So still 2-3x where we were in May, with a little asterisk that says we test a little bit more. So we're not quite back down to those levels, but boy, we've done a lot better. Now keep in mind, we see a certain population of patients who come to us because they're typically sicker, who get referred in by their physicians. So it's not quite the same level data, but still very encouraging to say that we've continued in the right direction. And our positivity rate is below 5 as it is across the Texas Medical Center. This is the number of patients across all of the Texas Medical Center institutions who get hospitalized on a given day. And you can see how fast that peaked. In fact, now we have a long enough trend in light blue. Those are weekly averages from the earlier portion, and then you get daily thereafter when it goes to dark blue. You can see how high it got. And we've come down very, very nicely, but clearly plateauing a little more over the last couple weeks. So I think we're starting to find the sort of steady state. I'm hopeful that we'll still have some decline, but we seem to be in somewhat of a steady state. And of course, the hope is that we don't see it go the other direction, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. This is our curve of patients in-house at Houston Methodist. The blue line is everybody in a bed. The other colors then are different kinds of beds. So the darker orange is medical surgical beds. The kind of gold is ICU beds, and the green is some intermediate beds. We've come down now solidly below 200, but kind of hovering right just below 200, which has been where we've been predicting for some time based on some of our modeling we might plateau. That's a plateau actually that looks like the first peak or foothill that I've talked about before. We can manage that plateau. We can do everything else we need to do for patients at that plateau level. The challenge is really if we reload the gun essentially and move back up, it can move back up very quickly. So we'd obviously still like to see that come down a little better. And here you see, we've diagnosed well over 17,000 people just at Houston Methodist alone. As of, these are 7 p.m. last night, as of this morning, we have crossed the 6,000 admissions thresholds. I would have never believed we'd have 6,000 people admitted for this illness. So it has been quite a significant journey, and we're in a much, much better place now, really able to do everything for other patients, and I'll talk some more about that coming up here. So a couple of questions here. Several, really about the spike. Did the fact that we had a spike this summer mean we're not going to have a spike this fall? Am I worried about a spike this fall? Other questions along those lines about are we ready for another surge, etc. So, I wish I had the crystal ball at every step of this. I wish I had the crystal ball. I don't have it. Let me tell you the things I worry about and the things that I'm less worried about. I think, we talked about these scenarios. This goes way back to like April, May. I gave it to y'all in one of those earlier presentations, and that was a bunch of different potential scenarios that were being estimated for this virus. I think we've seen most likely it is a kind of waxing and waning. I'm hoping that it is all of these different surges, but after we got through a big one here, or most markets seem to have either had that first or many then go through a second surge, that we don't see quite as big a surge, but that's a hope, honestly. Let me tell you the hopeful things for that. The hopeful things for that is, of course, a percentage of the population have already had it. So, we know that at any given time there should be fewer vulnerable people today than there were at the beginning. But that's hardly near any sorts of, unmasked kinds of herd immunity. What Dr. Sostman talked about was the fact that if we do a lot of the right things, we sort of mimic and get herd immunity because we're doing the right things. But of course, that doesn't let us act with impunity and just go out without a mask or without protections, without physical distancing, etc. So we know there's fewer people, but it isn't as dramatic a number as would markedly change that. There's still plenty of room to go up. But we don't know this issue about cross-reactivity that he talks about. Certainly it's plausible to think that one of the reasons, or maybe one of the main reasons, that we've seen such an amazing array of illness is because of some cross-reactivity that there is for other coronaviruses. In other words, some people have had it before and they have a little cross-reactivity and might have a milder reaction, and some people have never seen it before and they end up with a rip-roaring horrible reaction. We don't know that, but that is certainly a plausible theory or part of a theory. There's pretty good evidence to suggest, and I'll talk about that in a bit, that that was one of the questions at the end, that there is a genetic predisposition for some patients. We've seen this run in some families where there's clearly a genetic issue with how sick everybody has gotten. But again, complex, many factors as we look at that. So that's one question mark there that could help us. Some of the mathematical modeling also says, hey, these herd immunity numbers are a little too high because they just look at everybody as the same, and everybody's not the same. People act differently, different pockets act differently. We have, the more mobile people are more mobile, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some reasons to hope that there may be some attenuation. Really the biggest hope for me is if we look at that first surge in New York and other places, we look at the second surge here, people were not masking. I mean, the big reason we had that is we had many behaviors that were not in place, and yet today we kind of seem to have mostly gotten past the ridiculousness of the conversations we were having about masks, and people are just doing it. And I go to grocery stores wherever I go, and everybody's masked, and we've kind of accepted that. if we keep that going, if our politicians don't loosen the restrictions and make that, optional and all those, I actually think that will be a huge, huge sort of mitigating factor that will help us, even as we do many other things in society. On the negative side, again, we don't know, but we're also entering what would be theoretically the worst time of year, as Dr. Sostman talked about. It's drier air. The virus likes that. People are cooped up indoors. Certainly, we saw this in some data suggesting there was some connection to temperature and humidity, other levels. So there are some things, as Dr. Sostman talked about, that we can do to fight that. But some are just realities, right? In Houston, we're lucky because actually it's a time where we can spend more time outdoors in many ways and enjoy the outdoors. And so perhaps outdoor dining and other things like that could be really more meaningful as we come up here in the near future. There's a whole series of questions then about all of the noise about the CDC. So, the CDC records and keeps track of deaths. And there was a whole bunch of noise because there was this perception that the CDC recharacterized all of the deaths, and suddenly one arm, out on the internet was basically saying, well, see, this is all, this big conspiracy, and there's all these patients who are being reported with this illness who actually don't have this illness. So, obviously not true. I'll have you walk with Dr. Ortegon through our ICU and see all the patients we've seen here. I'll show you those numbers we've seen here. Clearly, this is the real deal. We've gone through that obviously many times before. But let's talk about the cause of death kinds of questions. We as physicians all have, throughout our careers, signed many a death certificate. And it's, as I heard one person say it to me, they said it's almost like an almost existential kind of question. I mean, oftentimes it's really hard to pinpoint exactly, right? People many times die from a multitude of things that pile up, or as they get older, sometimes it's very hard to pinpoint it's exactly this. But what we do know is that, and I can tell you for our data for sure, the vast majority of patients who we, who are on that list as dying from COVID, they died from COVID. I mean, they may have had heart failure, they may have had hypertension, they may have been a cancer patient or whatever was making them more susceptible. But had they not got COVID, they would be on the earth today in those situations. And so I think the data are very clear. If anything, we're underestimating, probably not overestimating the impact of COVID. And let me talk a little bit about why that is. Really, the ultimate metric to follow is what's called excess mortality. And I've shown you data around this a couple times, I think as early as probably in mid-April, end of April at one of our town halls, we talked about this. So this is from the CDC. And what you see then is a several year period, and you see this periodicity, and what you'll see in the blue bars is the actual data. In the line is what would be kind of their predicted based on year over year averages of what you would see in mortality. So anything above that line is when in that time period, it's weekly data usually, that you would have seen excess mortality. And we see this periodicity. That's because people tend to get sicker from respiratory illnesses, colds, flus, etc., flu being the bad actor in terms of deaths. And we see some higher deaths in the winter months. And so if you go back with me 2 flu seasons ago, what you see there is the bars went up over, and you see there's another measurement they do with that, with those plus signs, but they're basically the same thing. And so there was excess mortality during that period of time in the 17-18 flu season. I showed you data last time where we saw twice as many patients at Houston Methodist, but with a death rate that was less than a quarter of what we see with COVID. Last flu season, you see we had, pretty mild flu season. We had more deaths, but did not go above the sort of predicted. And then look what happened with our flu season. And then really as the flu season would normally be coming down in March, you see these very distinct excess mortality. So there's no question that we have significant excess mortality. Now, one of the questions asked, a very good question, and we don't know the answer to that, which is, well, would some of those people have died anyway, right? So if you were looking at any time period of mortality in 2020, are some of the people reflected in those bars there? They died in April of COVID, but they would have died in June or September or October. And that's certainly possible. That's certainly plausible. That's still lost, in those cases, months of life for those individuals. Obviously, nobody wants to die earlier than their time, but of course, that's a less impact than a 20-year-old who dies and loses 60 years of life. We won't really know that till we watch the data over the next couple of years, and we see whether there's essentially almost a compensatory decrease in these bars. So it's something to keep watching, but I believe the vast, vast, vast majority of this is excess mortality. You can see this very interestingly across different regions of the U.S. It fits what we know about the curves. So bottom left, you see Northeast and New York. And that huge early curve, top left, you see the South and Texas, and you can see really that surge. This cuts off towards the end of July, but you can see that surge for that whole region. And in the top right, you see different state data, and most of them seeing 15 to 20% or so excess mortality during those time periods. I think it's pretty clear cut. And in fact, when we study this time and time again, and we looked at this in New York, and I've shown you those data before, we looked at nationally, we've looked at it in multiple countries, the number of deaths through COVID don't actually explain the excess deaths that are being seen. So that means more people are dying from COVID, perhaps, is one hypothesis, or more people are dying for other reasons as a result of the pandemic, which is a very, very plausible hypothesis. And of course, I've shown you data about how many issues we've had with that. And in fact, on the bottom right, you see a paper that was done in Nature that shows several non-COVID related illnesses where we've seen significant upticks in mortality, not for patients with COVID, but patients who don't have a diagnosis of COVID. There may be some bleed-in, obviously, if they weren't identified, but we've seen an impact on other cause mortality as well. And we heard even in the psychiatric realm, of course, from Dr. Weinstein, concern about that as well with suicide and of course alcohol abuse and many other things that have happened during this time. So I want to read you a really lovely note I got the other day. I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this so I can read it here. But it says, I wanted to thank you for publicly encouraging people to do their routine medical appointments and that it was safe to visit Houston Methodist facilities to do them. After hearing you speak, I went ahead and scheduled my mammogram, which was about a month late. It turns out I have breast cancer, which was caught early because you said disease doesn't wait. I'm so lucky to be part of Houston Methodist family as I was able to get in quickly with wonderful physicians, great physicians, and have all the confidence in them. I wanted you to know that you helped save my life by encouraging me to do the routine mammograms. So I put that there because it's just such a real life example of what we've been saying to you for months now, and really what we had to fight for, frankly, with government officials and others through the summer and the press. Frankly, we didn't understand it when we said we have to care for people with everything out there. In this case, somebody was about a month late for getting their care, which is plus or minus really when people would normally come in for a mammogram. But imagine if it had been 6 months from now, the difference potential in outcome there. And colonoscopies, just primary care visits, all of the different scheduled surgeries, everything else needs to be happening as it would in normal times, and you need to think of caring for yourself in normal times. People ask also then, what did we do right? Why, have we done so much better? And I think it is cut and dry. If you look at this and you look at the first shutdown, 18 days to where we hit the peak. If you look at what happened this time around with the first phase masking and especially the second phase masking, the timing is almost eerily similar in terms of bending and then ultimately, in this case bending, because I think that was that first order, and then that second order really reversing the curve that was there. There's a lot that goes around masking. It's not just the masking. But masking is a big part of it. There's some valid theories even out there today that are suggesting that masks may also have an impact on viral loads. So it may be that we have some people get infected still, but now they're getting a low viral load, it's a minimal infection, they get immune. Again, data's fuzzy, but even on that end, it may work, but we know for sure it works in terms of preventing spread of the virus. So number one message, again, coming out of here, we all need to wear our masks, and it's going to be with us for a long time. We get asked about face shields. There's data emerging, and we're moving. We've moved to that for a while now in the clinical setting, but we're moving to that in many settings within our institution for people to add a face shield to a mask, not to substitute. So we've talked about the efficacy of masks. I think it's very, very clear now. When you talk about face shields, when we send you this out, you can go read a couple of these if you're interested. The bottom line is they're not a substitute for masks at all. So where they're really problematic is where people think I can put on this face mask that's not sealed and doesn't really keep things from coming around. It doesn't fully block me from expiring out with larger particles and think they're fully safe. But if nothing else, protects the eyes and probably even protects, obviously what's coming in even through a mask. In the healthcare setting, it looks like it's pretty effective, so we are using it much more. Question many of you will ask then is, should I be wearing one? I don't think we're going to see this be a widespread practice, nor right now with the virus down should it be. I would say two things. I would say if you are at more high risk, then really think about this. If you're in a high risk situation, really think about this. My son just flew off to college. He had goggles on during the flight. Just a logical thing to add to what he was doing, for example, in a high risk situation. If we see this go up again, I think that might be a case where we see that. But the reality is probably most people aren't going to. But if in doubt, it's certainly not going to hurt at this point and likely could help some more. Let's talk about flu. We've talked about this before. Dr. Sostman talked about it. Do we need to worry about this? Is this going to be really a mess? Should I get the flu shot? And what are we seeing in other parts of the world? And is it actually going to be a little better given all that we've done? And I showed some data last time, so I'm not going to re-show them. We saw much less flu in the southern hemisphere, so that's really good. It's got a lower R, so we know that it's less infectious than COVID, and it will be impacted by these measures. But we should get the flu shot individually for yourself. Protect yourself. We saw 60% mortality in the limited number of patients, but a meaningful number of patients who had both flu and COVID. Bad combination. But societally, we need to protect each other, and we need to protect our hospital capacity. The last thing we want to do is to struggle with a COVID surge because we have a baseline number of a couple hundred of flu patients in our hospital system that we could have avoided, 2/3 of those or 3/4 of those. So please get them. People ask about optimal timing. Right about now is perfect. Get it now, between now and the end of this month. Make sure you don't leave the month of September, I'd say, without having your flu shot in place. Let's talk briefly about schools. I talked about this last time, and we've got a lot of progress in this front. I'll remind everybody, fully supportive of the AAP's position, which says we need to get kids back to in-person learning as soon as it's safe. As we've talked about, we put together metrics from a TMC perspective. Here's the really good news about this. Since last month when I really said, hey, it's not time yet, we've had pretty consistent low R's, resulting in significant decrease in the viral numbers, even with all the messiness of the state data. So take that state data, the middle one, with a little bit of a grain of salt. It's probably higher than actual. And then really a positivity rate that is now solidly below 5. So we've made tremendous progress against this right now. There's many other things you can look at. This is a nationwide Harvard-based county risk level assessment. We're still mostly in their second worst category. We're not down to yellow yet. We're still orange for the most part in our greater region. The reality is the schools are starting to move back, whether the private schools or here I have a list of the public schools. And as messy and sort of individualized as this was, which I don't think was probably the optimal way to do it, it actually ended up working out in such a way that we've had, these are actually ranked by number of people, number of kids. In the school district. So we've had a smattering of some smaller ones go back just barely. They've only been a couple weeks, so it's too soon to know the impact. And really, this week was the time that several larger school districts are going back, either phased or something. I think they've put lots of protection in place. The biggies aren't going yet. So I think we're seeing an easing in. Certainly we're in a much, much better position now than we were a month ago, which was exactly what we were urging. I still disagree with a couple schools that went back, kind of that April or that August mid time frame. Wish they would have waited. Thankfully, they were smaller numbers. But now I think we're in a position we're moving forward with this. And I've talked to a lot of, analogous situation, churches, a lot of church leaders. Now's the time to cautiously think about advancing, to small groups in your churches, looking to go outdoors, etc. If you'd like to. It does seem like we're in a better place. Sports, we talked briefly about. I am nowhere near an expert on this. There is good CDC guidance, and it basically shows the spectrum of risk, which is very intuitive. Practicing outdoors, practicing in spacing is a lot safer than obviously getting, big groups of students running all over from school to school to compete in sports, closely at the other end of the spectrum. I think this is an individual school district decision. Most are somewhere on that left end of the spectrum and looking to see where things go to march up. A couple other quick questions that we get. One is lasting health effects. Remember, we talked about that in a previous talk. We talked some about the psychological events with that. I'm not going to go into the data around that, just to say this is an area we're very active with, both from a research standpoint with our curator database and from a recovery clinic. I met just yesterday again with our chair of medicine, who's one of the people coordinating, because it is multidisciplinary from almost every branch of internal medicine, cardiology, neurology, psychiatry, physical medicine, and rehabilitation. I mean, as you look at some of the quote-unquote long haulers, which is kind of the slang term that's been out there about patients who have long symptoms, we're going to be busy, I think, caring for a number of patients like that in these recovery clinics. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up, and I want to turn us to a really lovely program. Dr. Weinstein mentioned our music therapy program, and our Center for Performing Arts Medicine, founded by Dr. Dick Stasny. He's really been at the forefront of that. Todd Frazier runs that now. Robert Jackson is the chair of the board, and they have a program called MusiCare, and working with some national artists. I'm going to show you a really nice video here. Take a look at how this caught one of our team a little bit off guard, and some of the beauty of the things they've been focusing on. Thank you.
I was talking with the patient to see if he was ready to participate with me with physical therapy, and the patient was saying, I can't do it right now because Yo-Yo Ma is going to come and play for me. They're going to have a concert for me with Yo-Yo Ma. And I was just thinking to myself that this patient is very delirious, because how is Yo-Yo Ma going to be coming to play for him here? Only to find out then that, of course, Yo-Yo Ma was coming to play for him.
Sparkling away, very different.
Not only does it, I think, it lifts spirits up, but it helps us as nurses. You're surrounded by alarms and patients who are very sick and critical, but to have just such a talented person and so sweet, just providing his artistic gift is something that I'll probably never forget. Is one of the greatest things ever. Thank you, guys.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Center for Performing Arts Medicine launched these bedside concerts to bring world-class live music and a small dose of comfort and musical healing to patients and healthcare providers at Houston Methodist Hospital.
These concerts, they provide a different dimension to the healing process. It's not just physical healing, but it's the enrichment of the soul and the spirit. So I appreciate these artists and Methodist Hospital for considering that and putting that into their practice of medicine.
Well, I hope you really enjoyed that as much as I did and our staff did. It was really very meaningful for them, very meaningful for our patients as well, and a huge shout out to the Music Care program, to CPAM, and I specifically, of course, want to thank cellist Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, what an amazing treat to have Yo-Yo Ma as part of that. Houston Methodist Dr. May Ray, who created Music Care and was on piano, former Cleveland Quartet violinist Donald Weilerstein, and the Houston Symphony violinist Chris Neal. And so thank you very much to all who have supported CPAM and all that it's done for our patients. So we're going to transition now to a few questions that I'd like to cover. And let me just turn to a couple of our colleagues here. Dirk, how big a role do you expect rapid antigen tests to play in potentially allowing for a broader return to normal activities? There's some specific new ones that have gotten EUA clearance and others. Where do you see that playing out?
Yeah, at the moment, only in very specific situations. So, for example, college students coming back, that could be a role. The problem with the antigen tests is, number one, they're not very sensitive, maybe about half as sensitive as the molecular tests. And they're also, the specificity is not perfect, so you can have false positives. And when you've got the virus under control in a population, the positive tests are going to be about, at least half of them are going to be falsely positive. So I'd say areas where you're concentrating a lot of people together, or if we get another surge, the rapid antigen test could be quite useful.
Okay. Thank you, Dirk. So we had a question about whether this runs in families. I touched on most of that in my remarks, but we have definitely seen clusters in families. I think there's a genetic element certainly for some, but there's also some other elements that sometimes run in families. For instance, we've seen some families who had essentially the same major comorbidities, morbid obesity, diabetes, etc. So differentiating that at this point is very difficult. And of course, there's a viral load question as well. Sometimes you may have had those families together in a situation where they just got overwhelmed with large quantities. So, jury's still out. It's probably all of the above, like most things. I think there's decent evidence to suggest there'll be some genetic piece to this, like with most diseases, that we'll figure out over time. We'll keep you posted on that. So, Liisa, we had a question about some hospitals, these are not Houston Methodist hospitals, not having separate COVID units, asking about that issue, asking about hospital transmission, what we're seeing here at Houston Methodist.
I would say at Houston Methodist, we are definitely practicing safely. We have enough personal protective equipment, trusting our training for hand washing, and making sure that we're isolating patients appropriately. So I think it's not a problem here. The other thing I would like to point out is at this campus in the Texas Medical Center, we have moved to all private rooms on the inpatient units. So that does help control any infection, not even just COVID-19.
But every patient we have with COVID, we have designated units where we care for them,
we do.
Correct?
But again, in the public, there could be people walking around that aren't positive, haven't tested positive, and so we always practice diligently infection control practices on all patients.
Of course. Well, thank you. All right, Dr. Weinstein, let's drill down a little more on some of the psychiatric and mental health issues. So, from a mental health perspective, how do we return our focus to learning to live with COVID? Because versus sort of on bated breath waiting for a vaccine, which is, as we've seen, not just right around the corner. This is still going to be a while. And then also along with that, for people who are facing fear, anxiety, depression, how do you encourage them to feel safer as they go back out into the world? That we dealt with that certainly, with our staff as they came back from a shutdown at one point in time. So talk about those two questions.
So I think the question about how do we return to kind of living life while we wait for a vaccine, I think is a really critical one, because it's how we can alleviate our own suffering during this time. If we cling strongly to what the past has been, like gripping sand, it slips through our fingers and we lose touch with it. We have to pivot. We have to accept what we have lost and stand tall in the face of hardship and embrace what's around us. We may not be able to do all the things that we've wanted to do, but there is lots of wonder in what we can still do now. And we need to remain connected to that. Spend time with your family when you can. Even if it's on a screen, it's better than nothing. You can connect without touching. Do what matters at work. We have wonderful jobs where we get to go in and help people. Acknowledge and embrace that. This is how we continue to live a life that matters despite loss. How can we make people feel more safe? I think this program is a great example of how we can, because it communicates honesty about where things are. When we don't know, we are afraid. People can accept hardship and persevere if they feel like they understand the situation. So, give people solid information and they will rise to the occasion. I think we've seen that, throughout history, for our whole country. That is what Americans do. Honesty is by far what will provide us safety. When it's safe, we will tell you. People will listen. We will hear it honestly, and people will believe us, and they will go out into the world. If we don't give them information or we give them false hope, they learn not to trust us and pull away from life. So I think doing the kind of things like we've done here today is actually the very best thing that we can do for our community.
Thank you, Dr. Weinstein. We've touched on many of these through our talk, so I'm just going to try and hit a couple quick ones and then we'll wrap things up. Here's a question about two people in a high-risk group asking just nuts and bolt detail. If they have a plumber, repairman come in the house, they're masked, definitely need to be masked. Should they be doing other things like having them temperature check or anything else? Dirk, your thoughts on that?
It certainly can't hurt. We've had circumstances where contractors have come into one of our buildings, and we've discovered through our very careful temperature checking program that, I remember one case, an air conditioner tech had 102-degree fever, wanted to come in and work on the air conditioners. Would not have been a great thing. So I don't think it can hurt if you're in a high-risk group, but really, people are most infectious a couple of days before and a couple of days after they develop symptoms and signs. So the absence of a fever doesn't guarantee you anything. It's just kind of a little extra precaution. The masking is really the key factor.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dirk. That's good advice. I think, like everything else, I'm agreeing with Dirk. It's a spectrum, right? If you don't have high risks, probably masks are fine. You're interacting with people out in the community. It's not much different than seeing somebody in the grocery store. I mean, at least when I have a plumber over, even if I'm home, I'm not right there with them most of the time other than showing them where the problem is. So, use your judgment, but if in doubt, it's pretty simple to do, and any reasonable person should be willing to do that, and it's not obviously difficult. So with that, I'm going to wrap things up today. I really want to thank everybody again for being part of this series. As we said, going forward, these are going to be hosted by the Society for Leading Medicine. We have an email that will be going out with an email address if you have further questions, if you'd like information on that, if you'd like any other questions answered that we weren't able to get to, we'll do our very best to get back to you. I want to thank you again for your time and attention, and most of all, thank thank you for your support. I say let's all go practice some unlimited acts of kindness today and follow Dr. Weinstein's advice over the weekend, and we'll all do our part to make the world a better place over the weekend and make each other's lives better and enrich our own. God bless each of you, and thanks for being here.